I'm Shelley Klein, and I'm your host this evening for this presentation with Ambassador Martin Indyk, author of Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. We're so pleased that Ambassador Indyk is feeling better and is able to reschedule this event. Ambassador Indyk's presentation will be followed by a question and answer period. So you can type in your questions at any time with the Q&A button that should be at the bottom of your screen. The chat will be disabled. However, there will be a link in the chat to purchase your book. If you prefer closed captioning, those will also be enabled if you hit the button usually found at the bottom of your screen. And our event is being recorded. Martin Indyk is currently a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, previously served as executive vice president of the Brookings Institution. He was President Obama's special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, twice served as U.S. ambassador to Israel for President Clinton, was on the National Security Council, and was Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. This is just the abbreviated version of your impressive and distinguished resume. Ambassador Indyk, we are honored that you're joining us. We look forward to your presentation.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Shelley. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I want to start by apologizing for the fact that I wasn't able to be with you the first time and the inconvenience I caused all of you because of that medical situation I faced. But as you can see, I'm alive and well and delighted to have the chance to talk to you, even though it's virtually this evening. The book I've written is a book of deep history, but it has, as I hope you will come to see, great current relevance. Why write another book about Henry Kissinger? He has, after all, written many of his own. At the age of 99, he just published another book, and actually a very interesting book on leadership, on the great leaders that he has known. But every year, there's one or two more books on Henry Kissinger. This one, I believe, is different to all of the others, in the sense that notwithstanding the huge amount that's been written by him and on him, nobody has done a study of his efforts to make peace in the Middle East. And if you think about it, Kissinger is known for things like Vietnam, Chile, Bangladesh, détente with the Soviet Union, and of course, the breakthrough in relations with China. But the fact of the matter is that for the 4 years that he was Secretary of State, those years began with the second Nixon administration, which of course ended with Watergate, and then President Ford assumed the mantle of leadership. Kissinger worked with him. Those 4 years that he was Secretary of State, America's first Jewish Secretary of State, he devoted almost all of that time to his efforts to make peace in the Middle East. And the reason that I decided to go back and write this book about that effort was because I myself had been engaged, as Shelley mentioned, in the effort to make peace between Israel and the Arab states and Israel and the Palestinians. And after the last effort at that, which was in 2014, when I worked with Secretary of State John Kerry under President Obama to try to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in the negotiations that took place there between the Israelis and the Palestinians, those were the last negotiations that have taken place, 2014. There hasn't been any since in the 9 years since. And there hasn't been an agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, notwithstanding the efforts of 4 presidents since 1998, the Y Accords, which were negotiated between Prime Minister Netanyahu, then in his first term, and Yasser Arafat. Yes, Netanyahu reached an agreement with Arafat and gave up 13% of the West Bank. That was the last time that American diplomacy produced an Israeli-Palestinian agreement. And since then, it's been a record of failure by every president, including President Trump, who tried with the deal of the century, and he too failed. Having presided over the last of those negotiations, I felt that there was something wrong with the practice of American diplomacy, that it was fair and easy to blame both sides, as I did, but we too needed to take our fair share of the blame. And I decided that rather than write about that effort on its own, I would go back to where it all began with Henry Kissinger and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and try to understand from his experience and his efforts how to and how not to make peace in the Middle East, what role America can play in resolving conflict and helping Israel achieve peace with its neighbors, especially with the Palestinians. In going back to the origins of America's peace process diplomacy, I was aided by the fact that Henry Kissinger was both a man of history and a student of history. And because of that, he had kept notes, protocols, memos of all of his negotiations. And those have all been declassified and are now available to researchers and historians. In addition, Israeli archives of that period have also been opened, providing a way of checking the record with what the Israelis wrote about their experiences with Kissinger. And because the man is still alive and still functioning amazingly at 1999, I had the opportunity to talk with him at length. In fact, after every chapter that I drafted, I would go and sit with him and go over it. And amazingly, he would remember things that happened 45 to 50 years ago. I can't remember, I don't know about you, but I can't remember things that happened 5 years ago. But he has a memory for those things. And so I was able to draw on that as well. And I was able to illuminate the story of Kissinger's diplomacy in the Middle East with my own experiences in many of the palaces and offices of the prime ministers and kings and presidents and potentates that Kissinger dealt with, in particular with Yitzhak Rabin, who was prime minister when I became ambassador the first time, King Hussein of Jordan, President Hafez al-Assad of Syria, who were both still in power when I became ambassador or engaged with Bill Clinton on his peace team in the effort. And so that combination, that triangulation, gave me the ability to tell the story, to take the reader into those rooms where diplomacy takes place, where the negotiations take place, behind those normally closed doors, and to try to show how Kissinger made peace in the Middle East, and try to draw the lessons for today about how the United States should go about trying to deal with the conflict, which, as we see, rages again this very night in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. So that was the purpose of my excursion into the annals of history. What did I discover? Well, it was a surprise to me. I had written my PhD dissertation after the 1973 Yom Kippur War on the role of the United States in the efforts to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. I thought I knew Kissinger, but what I discovered was that I did not. And this first came to me when I was reading the protocols of his negotiations with Sadat and with Yitzhak Rabin and with Golda Meir and with Hafez al-Assad and King Hussein of Jordan. And what struck me as quite strange and unexpected was that in those protocols, the leaders he was dealing with would say to him, my people are ready for peace. I'm ready to take the big step. This was Sadat, this was Rabin, this was even Hafez al-Assad. And each time that they would say that to him, Kissinger would say, no, you don't want to do that. That's too ambitious. That's too risky. We have to try for something less. We have to go for something that's easier on both sides. And I did not understand why he was doing that. You would think that if the parties wanted to make peace, the role of the American mediator would be to get behind them, support them. And yet he backed away from that. To understand that, I could not go to what he'd written about his diplomacy there because it wasn't there. I went back to the first book he ever wrote. And to my surprise, I found it there in the title of the book and in the first page, the very first page. The book he wrote and published first was his PhD dissertation, which he wrote at Harvard. And it was a study of the role of two foreign ministers, Metternich and Castlereagh, foreign ministers of Austria and Great Britain, in the period after the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century, when these two gentlemen came together and forged a post-Napoleonic order in Europe that kept the peace more or less for 100 years before it all broke down at the beginning of the First World War. And Kissinger wrote about this, and he titled the book, A World Restored, Metternich, Castlereagh, and the Problems of Peace. You see there in the title was something that was the clue. For Kissinger, peace was problematic. And there in the first page of the book, he explains that statesmen, leaders, too often want to embrace the idea of making peace, of ending conflict. They are too passionate and too ambitious, he says, that it is the paradox of peace, that the pursuit of it in that way with passion and commitment and ambition, more often than not, leads to its opposite, that is to say, war. And that led Kissinger to be deeply skeptical of the idea of ending conflicts and achieving lasting peace. For Kissinger, the world, informed by his own experience as a Jewish student in his early teens, fleeing from the chaos of Nazi Germany and the persecution of the Jews there. 13 of his immediate family were murdered by the Nazis. He fled with his parents and his brother to New York. And that experience led him in his own life and in its approach to the world to seek order, not peace. The pursuit of peace with too much passion had led to appeasement of Hitler, had led to the post-World War I peace arrangements, which laid the groundwork for the rise of Nazism, the rise of Hitler. And that's what informed his worldview that he then went and studied how it was handled in the 19th century. And so it was when it came to the Middle East that he applied the same concern about the need to achieve order before peace. In Kissinger's view, peace would come eventually after the powers had exhausted all the other possibilities. But the natural state of things was a state of conflict between the powers, and that the only way to ameliorate conflict was to establish a balance of power between the major powers, between those who were committed to maintaining the status quo and the order, and those who would seek to disrupt it. And therefore, the balance of power tipped in favor of those who want to preserve the status quo was what mattered to Kissinger. If you could maintain a balance of power, you could ameliorate conflict. And eventually that might lead to peace. But the first priority was to establish order. What does this have to do with the Middle East? Well, when it came to the Middle East, Kissinger sought to achieve a balance of power, an equilibrium that would favor the status quo by supporting Israel in the Arab-Israeli arena and supporting the Shah of Iran in the Gulf. And these are the two powers, regional powers, to preserve order. We're talking now about the period before the 1973 war, when he was Nixon's national security advisor. And that worked more or less for about 3 years, not the 100 years that Metternich and Castlereagh's order had maintained. 3 years, because then it blew up when Anwar Sadat and Hafez al-Assad of Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel in October of 1973. And Kissinger, who'd just been sworn in as Secretary of State, suddenly faced with this major conflagration in the Middle East, with the potential for it to threaten a superpower conflict, because the Soviet Union in those days was backing Egypt and Syria, and the United States was backing Israel. So the potential for a clash between the superpowers was very real. Think about it in the context of the war we're going through in Ukraine today and the fear of escalation to a superpower conflict that exists now. And that's what he confronted then. His whole model for maintaining order had suddenly, surprisingly to him, fallen apart. And so he came in during that war to achieve a ceasefire and then begin a peace process where he would shuttle between Israel and Egypt, between Israel and Syria, between Israel and Jordan, also to Saudi Arabia to see King Faisal, who had imposed an oil embargo on the West, and had led to a spike in the price of oil and a world recession. And Kissinger went to work to rebuild the order in the Middle East on the basis of the same model that he had studied and written about in post-Napoleonic Europe. Now, you may think that's a bit weird to take what happened in Europe in the 19th century and apply it to the Middle East, but that's what he did. And surprisingly, it worked quite well. He negotiated agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria. the two agreements between Israel and Egypt, which led, first of all, to the disengagement of forces on the Suez Canal, and then a withdrawal of Israel into Sinai from the strategic Mittler and Jidi passes and the oil fields of Sinai. And those two agreements that he negotiated between Israel and Egypt laid the foundations for the peace treaty that Jimmy Carter negotiated at Camp David a mere year or so after Kissinger left office. That produced the Israel-Egypt peace treaty. His negotiation between Israel and Syria produced the Golan Heights disengagement agreement of 1974. That agreement has kept the peace more or less completely all the way up to the present between Israel and Syria. Golan Heights, in comparison to Israel's other borders, has been a very peaceful place, notwithstanding the lack of any peace agreement. But there was a formal disengagement agreement, Golan Heights disengagement agreement, observed by a UN force that's still up there today, that has been maintained by Israel and Syria, even though Syria descended into civil war. Even though the Iranians are trying to put their militias up on the Golan Heights, it remains a quiet place. And that is because of that disengagement agreement. That, in a way, comes closer to the model of Metternich and Castlereagh's European order than anything else that's occurred in the Middle East. Not peace, but an arrangement that prevents the outbreak of conflict. And that was what Kissinger was trying to achieve in the Middle East, and made considerable progress in doing so. His order that he created there was underpinned by a balance of power in Israel's favor after the 1973 war. But it was buttressed by the agreements that he struck with Egypt that took Egypt out of the conflict with Israel, and with Syria that effectively took Syria out of the conflict with Israel as well. And that peace process was a step-by-step process, an incremental process. That Kissinger called it a step-by-step process, designed not to resolve the conflicts, but to put the parties on the path towards a resolution in a way that would buttress the balance of power with a modicum of justice for both sides. The Arabs would regain territory in pieces, territory that had been occupied by Israel in 1967 in the Six-Day War, and Israel would acquire security arrangements and a degree of normalization that would help to create the recognition that it sought. And so, from Kissinger's point of view, that was enough. That the peace would come later. Indeed, the Abraham Accords occurred on the timetable that Kissinger had in mind, 40 years before the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco would agree to full normalization with Israel. That was the kind of time horizon that Kissinger had in mind. And in the meantime, what mattered was to maintain the order. And that design worked amazingly well. At the end of my writing of this book, I sat down with Kissinger for one last interview. And I said to him, "Did you ever regret not making the peace between Israel and Egypt?" After all, I said, I could see in the protocols that Sadat was ready and Rabin was ready too. He was dealing with Rabin. Carter was dealing with Menachem Begin subsequently. But Rabin was ready to do what Begin did, to take the big step in the Sinai, give up most of the territory in the Sinai. And said, you know, they were ready. They were telling you they were ready. But you didn't seize the moment. Did you ever regret not doing it after all? Kissinger, Carter made that peace a year later and got the Nobel Prize for it. And Kissinger said, no, he didn't regret it. That he was happy it happened. He was gratified that he was able to make a contribution to it. But that had he been Secretary of State again after those elections, in other words, had President Ford won and reappointed him as Secretary of State, he would not have gone for the peace treaty that Jimmy Carter went for. He would have taken another step, a non-belligerency agreement between Israel and Egypt, consistent with his incremental step-by-step approach. And I said, why? He said, because I always feared that if I pushed it too hard, I would break it. And for me, that was a light bulb moment, because when I worked with President Clinton at the end of his administration, we took Ehud Barak, Prime Minister of Israel, and Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinians, to Camp David. Reality is we schlepped them there. Arafat did not want to go. Barak insisted on it. And we dragged Arafat there, and he told Clinton beforehand, I am not ready for an end of conflict agreement. But we didn't listen to him. And we insisted, essentially following Barak's insistence, that we go for an end of conflict, end of claims agreement, that we abandon the step-by-step process of the Oslo Accords, which were totally Kissingerian when Rabin introduced them, having learned from Kissinger, that a step-by-step approach was the wisest thing to do to try to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But we didn't know Kissinger in those days, and Barak certainly didn't know Kissinger. And so instead of that incremental approach, we abandoned it in favor of an effort to resolve the conflict in one swoop, with too much passion, too much ambition, and we broke it. And in breaking it, just as Kissinger feared, what happened was the outbreak of the Second Intifada and the complete engulfing of the structure of peace, the framework of peace that we had struggled for 8 years to build, was completely destroyed in that paroxysm of violence that lasted for 5 years. It killed thousands of Israelis and Palestinians and destroyed all of the trust between the two sides that we had worked so hard to build in the previous 8 years. And ever since then, it's been impossible for American presidents and their secretaries of state to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, to restore a peace process, restore the trust, and bring the Israelis and Palestinians finally to an end of their conflict. And so that is the lesson that I took away from the study of this master of the game, Kissinger's role as diplomat in Middle East peacemaking, that it is better to be cautious, that it is better to take an incremental approach to try to rebuild trust, that it is better not like the 4 presidents that have tried to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian, not to try to resolve the conflict, but to try to build towards its resolution. And that is the Kissingerian way, and that is the way that the United States now needs to play its role in trying to help the parties move towards a resolution of their bloody conflict. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Indyk, for those thought-provoking, fascinating comments about your book. The book has so much in it. It is really so detailed, and Kissinger truly was the master of the game. I mean, what a genius, and what stamina. That shuttle diplomacy was amazing. And what was one of the things that was fascinating to me that you talked about was his worldview was really shaped by his study of Europe, and he really wasn't that prepared to instantly become so immersed in Middle Eastern politics, and yet he learned it and mastered it, as you said. But his worldview was also about a balance of power. And so in some ways, the seeking of peace, or the incremental steps toward eventual peace, was secondary to the balance between the US and the Soviet Union at that time. So how did that affect his diplomacy then?
Well, yes, there was a balance of power between the superpowers in America's favor, but there was a balance of power in the region of the Middle East between the regional powers. Mm-hmm. And there, the United States and the Soviet Union were backing. The Soviet Union was backing Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, the three major Arab powers at the time. And the United States was backing Israel, Iran, which was the regional power in the Gulf, and Saudi Arabia, although Saudi Arabia had oil power, it didn't have a lot of military power. And the smaller kingdoms that were necessarily committed to the status quo, like Morocco and, of course, Jordan. But what he discovered in 1973 was that it wasn't enough just to maintain a balance of power. That the Arabs had a grievance against Israel because Israel had occupied their territory in the 67 war, which they had effectively started. The Arabs had started Nasser in Egypt. But Israel had won and had occupied all of the Sinai up to the Suez Canal, and the Suez Canal was shut down. Mm-hmm. And the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem, and all of the West Bank. And as a result, the Arabs wanted their territory back, not an unreasonable position to take. But because Kissinger was focused on the balance of power, there was no diplomatic recourse that they could take. There were various efforts, but they went nowhere. And Kissinger had effectively tried to freeze the conflict, much like Metternich and Castlereagh, and had reached an agreement with the Soviet Union that neither side would support an effort by their clients to disrupt the status quo, to launch war. It became part of the détente. And so the Soviet Union was holding back arms to the Arabs, and the United States was supplying arms to Israel to maintain a balance of power in Israel's favor. And Sadat couldn't live with it, decided he couldn't survive politically unless he found a way to regain Egyptian territory. And that's why he decided secretly to launch war. Actually, it wasn't such a secret. He said repeatedly that he was going to go to war if he couldn't get his territory back through diplomacy. Mm-hmm. And he launched various initiatives, including one secret one, where he sent his national security advisor to see Kissinger and to provide him with an initiative that Sadat was ready to take if the United States would get behind it. And Kissinger listened to this far-reaching initiative, was quite impressed by it. He went back to Nixon and was quite excited, and Nixon got excited about it. And he then sat down with the Israeli ambassador in Washington at the time to explain to him what he had heard from the Egyptian National Security Advisor. And the ambassador at the time was a man named Yitzhak Rabin. And he listened to this report from Kissinger and he dismissed it completely. There's nothing there. There's nothing new there. Rabin was very good at being dismissive, as I would later discover. And then Golda came to town and she dismissed it as well. And Kissinger said, well, okay, if the Israelis don't want to pursue it, I'm not going to pursue it. And he dropped it. It's a counterfactual, but if he had not dropped it, if he had insisted on it,
hypothetically,
it's entirely possible that the war would have been avoided and a peace process could have been launched. But he was so committed to the status quo and the balance of power that he did not pursue it.
Right, he didn't see that. There was some poignant incident where I think during the Paris peace talks with the Vietnamese, a Egyptian representative went to talk to him, predicting the war, and when Kissinger said, ignored him, the guy like broke down crying because he knew what was about to happen.
Yeah, exactly. It's not exactly clear what Kissinger said to the Egyptian National Security Advisor in that meeting, which was in May before the war, which took place in October. But he dismissed the initiative. And he, according to one account, there were only two of them, they went for a walk in the garden, but according to one account, as told to the CIA station chief by the Egyptian National Security Advisor at the time, Kissinger told him, we only respond to crises. So if you really want to get our attention, you have to provoke a crisis. As I say, that may not be accurate, but it's not inconsistent with the approach that Kissinger had taken at that time. And the point, Shelley, is that once the war broke out, Kissinger realized that it was not enough just to have a balance of power. You had to have a legitimizing process that would give the Arabs a stake in maintaining the status quo. And that process had to involve a territorial component. I really want to underscore that, a territorial component. Because today, Netanyahu is telling Israeli people, peace for peace. We don't have to give up territory anymore. We can get peace for peace. And that's true when it comes to the Emirates or Bahrain or Morocco. But it's not true because it doesn't resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so that was the heart of Kissinger's approach, an incremental, step-by-step approach in which he understood that Israel could not be expected to withdraw in one step to the 67 lines, that politically, excuse me, the leadership couldn't handle it, and it would put Israel in an impossible position. Instead, he wanted to buy Israel time to strengthen itself with the support of the United States, in time for the Arabs to come to terms with Israel, to accept Israel. And so his formula was not territory for peace, it was territory for time, because he didn't believe in peace, territory for time. But the sad irony, and he would be the first to admit it, was that he persuaded Israel to adopt this approach, and it became the foundational basis for Israel's approach to its conflict with the Arabs. And in the process, Israel gave up territory, got peace between Israel and Egypt, and this disengagement agreement with Syria, and a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, and then the Abraham Accords. But in the process, Israel also settled the West Bank. In Kissinger's day, there were 1,600 settlers. 1,600. Today, there are 560,000 and 140 settlements and over 100 illegal outposts, illegal in under Israeli law. And the whole idea of a territorial based process seems to have become impossible. Instead, the push within Israel's current government is to annex the territory, not to give up any of it. And so as a result, we don't have a peace process, not just because of that, but we don't have a peace process. We don't have a political horizon, and we don't have a way of moving the parties towards an eventual resolution of the conflict. Instead, we are sliding back into what looks like a full-fledged intifada.
Right, 50 years after the occurrences in your book. That was 73. Now it's 23.
Right. Right. Now, of course, we made a lot of progress between Israel and the Arabs during that period.
With the Arab states, but then there's
Yes.
these non-state actors that, again, what I don't think were in Kissinger's worldview at the time, right? Also.
Yes, and that's a very good point, because as I've explained, Kissinger's view of the world was a hierarchical one in which it was the great powers or the superpowers who would establish the order and maintain it, or the regional powers in the Middle East would establish the order and maintain it. He had no time for non-state actors. The PLO for him was a nuisance. He actually opened a dialogue with them through the CIA long before Rabin had engaged with the PLO. But that was to just keep them quiet. He did not have any intentions of resolving the Palestinian conflict. That was way too far off for him, way too complicated. And it was a non-state actor, as you said. So he preferred that Jordan and Israel resolve that problem, handle that problem as the two powers that could control the Palestinians. And that's the way he preferred to deal with it. Today, he is all in favor of a Palestinian state, because he only understands a world of states. Can't deal with non-state actors in his hierarchy of states. So he's in favor of a two-state solution. But the achievement of it should be done incrementally, step by step.
It's been generations now, step by step. Yeah. We have some other questions about the current political situation, foreign relations. Are Israeli-Arab tensions on President Biden's agenda? Are you familiar with current State Department activities? Yeah.
So President Biden has a few other issues to deal with. A war in Ukraine and the need to deal with blatant Russian aggression and the threat that poses to world order. And of course, the rise of China and China's assertiveness in Asia, which is another challenge to the world order. We hear a lot about the return of geopolitics. This is the return of Kissinger's world.
More great powers. Yeah.
There's exactly conflict between the great powers. And so that is understandably and correctly the preoccupation of President Biden and his team of national security advisors. And from their point of view, what they want in the Middle East is calm, quiet, so that they can focus elsewhere. And that has been their approach, to just calm things down as much as possible. Now, as we know from our own experience, the Middle East is not a calm place. It's a volatile place, full of conflict, not just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so they've tried where they can to ameliorate those conflicts, maintaining a balance of power, again, in favor of Israel and the Sunni Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco.
Mhm.
The other powers, Syria and Iraq, have essentially been removed from the equation for all intents and purposes. And Iran is the power that threatens the status quo,
Regional power. Yeah, yeah.
that seeks to achieve hegemony in the region. And so the United States, no longer willing to dominate the region in the way that Kissinger created and was maintained for some 4 decades. Now we're shifting to a supportive role of Israel and the Sunni Arab states as they hold the balance against Iran. And the Abraham Accords are an important part of that, as are the peace treaties between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan. And so essentially that's the approach that Biden has been pursuing. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, he doesn't believe that it's possible to resolve the conflict. He was there as vice president when I was engaged in the negotiations that failed in 2014. And so he's correctly skeptical that there's a willingness on the part of the Palestinian leadership, Abu Mazen, or for that matter, the Israeli government under Netanyahu. There's a willingness to make the critical and difficult compromises that could potentially lead to a resolution of conflict. So he just prefers to try to work with Israel, Palestinian leadership, Egypt and Jordan, keep things calm. And that found expression this last weekend in Aqaba, where formally Egypt and Jordan came into the process of trying to calm things down in the West Bank under American auspices. But it's not working.
Right. It's not calm there, is it? Yeah, yeah.
Right. And it's not likely to work. Things have deteriorated so much on the Palestinian side. And now we have a government in Israel which has members, we know, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who represent the settlers and who are determined to
compromise is not in their vocabulary.
No, they're not interested in anything but the collapse of the Palestinian Authority. And so on both sides, you don't have the means to move towards a resolution of the conflict. And the Palestinian Authority has basically lost control. Its authority is crumbling. Palestinian security forces are being urged to step up and take control, and they can't. And because they can't, they won't. They are very unpopular now. They don't want to be seen as Israel's policemen if there's not going to be some process in which a Palestinian state is established alongside Israel. So the means aren't there. If the Israeli army has to keep on going in to arrest the terrorists, that leads to clashes, and those clashes are gaining more and more popular support. And so we're in a kind of downward spiral now, I fear. And what's so worrying about this situation is that the youth, Palestinian youth who are engaged in these terrorist attacks that we've seen in the last year, they call themselves the Lion's Den. They're not affiliated to Hamas or to Fatah, the party of Abu Mazen. They're organizing themselves. They have easy access to weapons, which are smuggled in from Israel and from Jordan. And they have a target-rich environment of settlers. You said there are 200,000 more settlers there today than there were the last Intifada 20 years ago. And these youth don't remember how bad the last Intifada was for the Palestinians. So they're not deterred by that memory. They were at best infants in those days. And so the crumbling of the authority, the rise of the far right in Israel that's opposed to any kind of resolution of a political process to resolve the conflict, and the free reign, almost free reign that's given to these young militants and terrorists, is and the way in which this kind of moves to Jerusalem, where you who've been to Jerusalem know very well that Israelis and Palestinians live cheek by jowl in Jerusalem, and the religious dimensions of the conflict come to the fore in Jerusalem, and in particular in Ramadan and Pesach,
Right.
which we're approaching now, when emotions rise, and there are events connected to that. And so as a result, I fear that we're moving into what you could call a perfect storm
Yeah.
of factors which I'm afraid are going to lead to greater conflagration.
I saw you quoted as being hopeful, like you had to be hopeful. But it there's no, in the near term, it doesn't look too
No.
positive. Yeah.
So hopeful in the sense that I'm not sure what you saw. I get quoted a lot these days, but I'm not hopeful at all in the short term. We're going to have to find a way out of this, and the United States is going to have to become more involved. But we don't have the requirements. We don't have a Sadat or a Begin, or a Rabin or a Golda or even a Hafez al-Assad in those days, and King of Jordan.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's very difficult to see a way out, but we have to find a way to relaunch a process. In the end, I am hopeful that the two sides will come to understand that there's only one way to resolve this conflict, to end the conflict. It doesn't lie in a one-state solution, whether that proposed by the Ben Gvirs and the Smotriches or that proposed by Hamas. Those are just recipes for continuing conflict. But a resolution of the conflict can only come from a separation of Israelis and Palestinians, and the end of Israel's military occupation and the establishment of an independent Palestinian state that lives alongside Israel in peace and security alongside the Jewish state of Israel. But we're a long way from that at the moment.
It's hard to figure out what that's going to look like, or
how to get there from here.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's why Kissinger's approach is so important, because the only way is not to try to bang their heads together, bring them to Camp David and resolve the conflict. It's to start the slow and difficult process of rebuilding trust, step by step, incremental steps, which will include Israel giving up some territory that gives the Palestinians the hope that their grievance can be resolved eventually.
Thank you. On that note, we're pretty much close to our allotted time, unfortunately. Again, this is a wonderful book, very detailed. I got so much out of it. It was amazing to me. All the, I thought I knew what was going on, but I didn't. I really didn't have a clue. And we didn't touch on the fact that while he's dealing with the Yom Kippur War and the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, the negotiations for the end of the war in Vietnam are happening, and the Nixon White House is imploding. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in this book. So I highly recommend it. So thank you. Thank you so very much. We really appreciate it. We appreciate the time that you could give us. And thank you for writing the book. It was wonderful. Before we close our program, in addition to thanking our author, I'd like to acknowledge some of the people involved in this presentation. Thank you to our dedicated Book Festival committee members, our advanced readers, the Federation staff, and our hardworking coordinator, Rebecca Russell, the Jewish Book Council in New York, from which we choose our authors, our behind-the-scenes tech wizard, Jake Tavel, and our Literary Circle members whose financial support make these events possible. So thank you and good night.